Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Steps Collective of 2025, he said, trying to frantically remember what year it was. Um, the Thank you for joining us all. We are today talking about the theme of renewal, and the first point on renewal is this is year two of the Steps Collective. Um, for those of you that haven't been to one before, essentially it started when myself, Lizzie, Andy, Rob Phillips, Emily Boxall, LCA, were talking about. We just have lots of questions around the word regenerative, and it keeps popping up in lots of different places. And you go, well, hang on, is this regenerative in fashion the same one as they talk about in farming, or the same one that has been around for ages in urban regeneration, or the sort of as it emerges out of different sectors and so on? And we just started sharing questions in various different places. And we committed last year to running 12 things, to be gloriously specific about them. Um, and we decided sort of like in the wrap up, in the harvesting and composting session in December, we thought, oh, well, this was good. People are interested in this. Let's do it again. We've welcomed Esther on board to the stewarding committee. Is it a committee, Andy, Lizzie, ish thing? People
Makes
who
it
are a
sound
bit
too
more
formal.
responsible. Sorry, Andy.
Makes it sound too formal and kind of with it to be a committee.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a back channel.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. The stewarding back channel. But the sort of so the idea, in fact, I'll share a Miro board in a minute because we'll go through it. But the idea this year is that we do it again, but what we'll do is a regular monthly Friday lunchtime thing, which will just be a bit like this, just where we sort of like take a one-word theme, in this case renewal, and go, what does this mean to us in terms of regeneration and our own practices and experiences and the things that we see around us? But these won't be the only Steps Collective things. We're also sort of like thinking of sort of like this is a platform for other sorts of things, and for reasons I'll go into in a minute. They can be in different places, different cities, in the countryside. They can be walks, they can be little online chats, they can be podcasts, whatever else. Um, but there's enough in this to go sort of like, oh, these are the seeds of something, and the thing you do with seeds is plant them in other places and see what happens. So. Anything to add, Lizzie, Esther, Andy? Much shaking of heads. So I will share the Miro board. So looking at who's here today, I'll do a very brief recap. Originally in 2023, we started. Lizzie made me do a talk. Let's put it that way. I'd written a blog post and said, "Oh, you should do a talk for something I'm doing for London Climate Action Week at the RSA on the steps." So that talk was called No Time for the Long Way Round, some early thoughts on regenerative triangulation. And that was kind of, there was only about 6, 7 of us there, but it was a really fascinating conversation. And then we spoke to Andy, and then we spoke to Rob and Emily, and we thought, oh, maybe we could sort of like all get together and do a similar event and keep asking those questions. There's a little recording of it there on this Miro board. I'll share this in the chat as well. Copy post. I mean, I'll share it in the chat if I can find the chat. Da-da-da. So there you go. You can have a little poke around on that at your leisure. And so that's where the Steps Collective came from. We documented in the harvesting and composting meetup at the end of the year all of the different events. So there's sort of like we have our 12 here. There's also something that I remember in the interim of setting this up, which I think Esther was a little small Barcelona thing where just as an adjunct to a course I was doing there that Esther was also on, um, we talked about the Steps Collective and some regenerative stuff as well. So there's maybe 13 things that happened, but those were the 12, and they were a mix of online things, they were in-person things, they were Sometimes field trips. We went to NEP. We went to the Design Museum to see the solar exhibition. Um, we hung out in Makerversity and sort of like in small groups talking about how we could choose a local space that means something to us. And what we would do for all of these things is at the beginning, we just sort of set the tone by reading the words and just go, oh, okay, so this is what the Steps Collective is, this is what we're here for, and then we would let it unfold. It was never very planned. Sometimes you had to get people to a particular location, but that was kind of okay. And I think sort of like, and we started capturing some of our like notes down the bottom of each of these things just to go, what is it? So the point of the harvesting and composting thing was, what was good about these things? What do we want to keep? What do we want to sort of like take into the next year if we're doing it again? To be able to sort of like not just do another 12 things ourselves, although we will, but actually offer it as a kind of like a starting point, a springboard. Indeed, steps is kind of like the acronym is show the easy place to start. How do you use this material that we've collectively worked on across the year just to give other people an easy place to start with inviting people into a regenerative practice conversation? So saying that sort of like this is a weird word. This is kind of like it's not quite fixed in any one domain or any practice and so on, etc. But and I remember Matt and Jenny at the Brighton event just going, I just really want people to talk to about this because I think in the talking about it and the sharing perspectives, I'll begin to understand it more for myself. So I'm going to open up to Lizzie and Andy and Esther shortly. Warning, guys. Um, just to go sort of so the thing that I'm feeling more as a kind of like a renewal thing from the Steps Collective is I want to renew all of those opportunities and make more of them. Sort of at that point where people go, I want to have a conversation about this with people locally to me or online around a specific thing or just reflect on one angle. And it can be large, it can be small, it can be quick, it can be a whole day, whatever you want it to be. But I think just like the most important thing I want to renew is that sense of sort of like this is a thing that helps conversations start. Over to Lizzie.
Sorry. I said to John when I arrived, I don't know what Zoom update happened between yesterday and today, but a whole bunch of things are not working like they should. So that took a bit longer to come off mute. Um, so what's my prompt renewal for
Yeah,
the year? Um, well, so I guess for me, my reflection through this, like thinking all the way back to kind of first seeing John, your kind of post on LinkedIn, and then being like, I feel there's something here, and there's something in the sharing something before it's finished or before it's sort of professionally ready that I have intuitively felt is part of regenerative practice. This idea of something not being finished creates space for other people to contribute. And if you have like the answer or the perfect thing or the finished argument, you don't create space for anyone else. And I had always been impressed, intrigued by John's work. And for me, as someone who has spent like my career in this sort of peripheral, like designy kind of space, but with quite a lot of imposter syndrome around like the people who very confidently go out in the world with like, I don't know, and present themselves as like an expert in this. I like that's never sat well with me. And over the course of the last year, what has been a real joy is kind of being in an environment with really smart, but more than that, thoughtful and intentional and like careful people. Being able to explore in a way that doesn't require any of us to have answers, but to share our process and be inspired by one another, which has been really lovely and really generative in sort of quite a quiet way, which I've also really enjoyed. So for me, this year is one of huge transition for two reasons. The biggest one is I'm relocating from London to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so the sort of it will become less easy for me to be on calls like this or join in kind of events in this hemisphere, but I'm really excited about the propagating seeds in other places in that same sort of convivial way. And then the other part for me, I was halfway through an MA in regenerative economics at Schumacher when Schumacher closed. And now I'm transferring to the regenerative design program at Central St. Martin's. So maybe that will put to bed some of the imposter syndrome that I have. But also in that, we'll be spending my time scoping kind of my field work and like that actually what academic research might I contribute to this space, and thinking quite a lot around methodology and tools and practice, and in a way that the conversations over the last year have really contributed to that thinking. So I think for me, the kind of sense of renewal is kind of we sort of had this early enthusiasm and then a commitment of what the first year looked like, and kind of got to the end of that. And now it's almost like pause, take a deep breath, and what's going to emerge next. Which there are many things in my life that feel like complete chaos. And when I think of like this community and this conversation, it actually feels like very calm and spacious. And I'm sort of super excited to both meet you all, because actually there aren't that many people on the call who are, at least I've met at other Steps Collectives conversations, which is interesting in and of itself, of how each one of these conversations draws different people from our respective communities, which is amazing. So yeah, I think that's my very rambly response to to the prompt. Andy, you're next.
Yeah, John sprung this on us, so I'm sort of. I was glad that Lizzie went first. I had a moment to think about what my renewal reflections are, and I'm still thinking about them now. I think what was interesting about last year is we probably started off. I mean, you can tell in the name, show the easy place to start, where we thought, oh, we'll get a bunch of not necessarily experts, but people have been thinking about this stuff for a while or are starting to think about this, and we'll sort of do a series of talks and then conversation. And then we found that actually, the conversation was probably more important than the talks. And then the other reflection on that is that even though some people have been thinking about this for quite a while in various different fields and various different ways, and from the outside they might look like experts, I think by their own acknowledgement, they are still finding their way. And that is very much kind of reflected in the way that we introduce the sessions as well. So the words that actually John hasn't said this time, have you? But basically, it reflects this idea that there are no experts. And I thought that that's kind of interesting. And for me, I guess the renewal reflection is I'm always trying to just find ways where we avoid falling back into the same habits and routines of how things work today. So even calls like this, like how do you make calls like this not kind of fall into these kind of traditional tropes of like what a call should or shouldn't be? And it's really hard, but for me, like maybe that ties into this theme of renewal, because there's this idea of constantly needing to renew the things that you take for granted. And it's very obvious that the world is changing, like for better and for worse. So I'd like us to counterbalance a lot of the change that we're seeing for the worse. Like the rules that we used to engage by are clearly dissolving. Like you can see them right in front of our eyes dissolving. But some of them are very much for the worse. So like let's find some renewals that are on the opposite side of that spectrum. And it does feel like it's happening. So communities like this and spaces like this, I think, are really beneficial to see that other people are thinking in similar ways or in different ways, but trying to approach the same kind of issues from different perspectives, really. So so I think that's my renewal. So yeah, for this year, I think there's something interesting about us trying to make this a little bit more predictable, but hopefully having enough variation within each of the sessions that we can kind of really, yeah, use our collective wisdom, I think, a bit more than where we were when we started. So that's my reflection. I don't know, Esther, if you have anything or if I'm putting you on the spot.
I'll probably keep it short because you all have said really beautiful things that resonate and sound like what I would say. I think one reflection I just want to add is also, you know, having been more of a participant in the last year and now moving into thinking about what renewal looks like in this upcoming year. One is thinking back to that conversation we had, John, in Barcelona, and how much actually maybe my perspective on regeneration has shifted, not only with new information from conversations like this, but also how the world has also, you know, composted what regeneration means for it, and new issues and new problems and new questions have all popped up, and how that has informed what a regenerative practice is needed for. And so I'm excited to think about how those external factors continue to influence this conversation, and how also expanding it more globally as you go to another hemisphere, Lizzie, and also as I join from Berlin. And I know there's faces here that aren't as Northern Hemisphere centered. And so how does that conversation continue to transform and renew, even though we had all of these 12 conversations last time, and now they're going to look a little bit different, and what that looks like to be behind the scenes in the backdoor channel as well. So yeah, 2025 should be full of interesting conversations.
Thank you all. As I've just dropped in the chat, I'm going to open it up to the floor next, and just if you are sort of jump off any of these points or tell us what we're in early January, so people won't be doing a lot of thinking since Christmas, but with the exception maybe of Tom, who put in the chat he's doing the regenerative design at CSM currently. At this point in the year, what did regenerative mean for you over the last year, two, week, month, whatever? And what does renewal into this year then look like for you? What are you taking? What are you leaving? What are you curious about? What do you want to find out more about? I'm one of these annoying facilitators who will sit until someone talks. As Esther knows.
I have something. But I don't really know how to explain it. I feel like it's quite personal. So I moved house, and as I think people who have bought houses before, which I've never done, you discover that the house is in a much worse state than when you looked at it. And then there's a lot of like stuff you need to do. So I've been doing renovation, which is not exactly regeneration, but it's renovation. And in the process of doing that in the last couple of months, I've done a lot of what I can only call resentful learning, where I learn how to do something new, but I'm a bit annoyed about the fact that I've gained a new skill through quite a lot of stress, but like I don't feel happy about having learned a new thing. I think because of the stress. So what I'd like to leave in the last year is that feeling of learning being something I do resentfully in order to fix a hole in the wall, and to do it more deliberately and happily and willingly, and be proud of the things that I've learned rather than being just annoyed that now I know how to do this thing.
That's really interesting because I remember one of the things from last year us touching on, and I think quite early on, was regenerative should try or will hopefully or should try as hard as it can not to fall down the same sort of, to your point of learning, Misha, sustainability went very, very technocratic in a way. And it was like, you have to learn how to do this thing in a particular way to do that, and then this thing will happen and such and whatever else and so on. And it stops people. And it might even create that same sort of resentful learning in everything from individual person scale up to organization scale. The resentful learning of how to be better or do better. It's like, and we've been, I think, finding ways to talk about that over the last year, although that's now sharpening another reason to think about it in the context of, so way back when one of the kind of like the early talks was talking about whenever someone says we've got to move through sustainability, we've got to move beyond sustainability towards regeneration. It's both a spatial and a temporal metaphor that means you have to do one before the other. You have to
Yeah.
get to this place first and then do this, or you have to achieve this thing first in time and then you can go on to there. And to me, to us, I don't think that's true. I think that sort of actually going from here to regenerative could be in a very different direction than going from here to sustainable. And so this very idea of sort of you have to learn all of these sustainability things first to then become regenerative feels wrong, or at least not helpful. Oh, Fiona's written in the chat. Yes, fine. Write in the chat, Fiona. Cool.
I do agree a lot with the principle of sustainable and regenerative aren't on a straight line, so they're not actually sitting on a spectrum. Especially because I'm not confident the end results of them are the same anyway. So why would they be on the same vector?
Right.
But also, there's sustainability feels like a new concept, and it feels very business driven because we want to sustain a system, whilst regenerative practices are just likely just organic practices that have been around. It's how the world generally works. And it doesn't feel like it requires the retrofitting the sustainability does, because sustainability is there to keep business going, I feel, rather than to keep people going.
Very much. How do we keep getting away with this? What's the least we need to do to keep being able to just run the models and the practices and the services and the supply chains that we do? Other thoughts?
I will try to jump on the conversation. Hello, everyone. I think that some things that all of you have said resonates a lot with things that I have been thinking precisely. No, sometimes, for example, here in Spain, when companies jump into the sustainability thing, they even don't think on the term of sustaining their own business or different lines of business, but they simply think that's an issue for for responsible social company and all the stuff that they have normatives, regulation and all that. And it's the new word, a new flavor, no, for saying in some way, and the dangers that they are almost close to absorb the term of regeneration, no, also as a new flavor of sustainability is in there. I think that I love to see this new term of renewal for this occasion, because I think that regeneration connects a lot with the idea of we need to change the paradigm on the bold view that sustains at the same time the shape, the structure, at least abstract the structure, no, of the infrastructure, the material part. I think that it's really hard to change as small agents, for saying some way, no, as individuals or as small companies and so on, because we don't have this inertia, and
Inertia, yeah.
sorry, that big companies or big structures have. I think that's the biggest issue. I don't know. I think that maybe part of the renewal thing is also taking inspiration on the fungi. Well, everybody is in the fungi thing. I'm sorry. I don't know. I thought that I have also. Well, I am hungry. I am sorry.
What's
My
the thing that I latched
ah
on the thing that I latched onto there specifically was when you were talking about sort of the small agents having more ability than kind of like the larger organizations to be able to think about and do things differently. And I'll drop a link onto the board after this to a podcast that Teresa Chahine did with Vincent Stanley of Patagonia, which was on regenerative capitalism generally, but in the last 5 minutes of it, they started talking about something that Teresa said, oh, this is just a word we joke around with in our class, but it was extrapreneurial. And so like, entrepreneurial is if you are small and independent and just getting on and doing things.
yeah
Intrapreneurial is very familiar. It's kind of like you go, yes, I'm doing these sorts of like entrepreneurial things, but within the context of a fixed organization.
yeah
What you're driving at, Liz, I think, is this kind of sense of the extrapreneurial is like, how can I be part of one organization but see someone in another one or another group and go, oh, well, we should talk. And then you begin to build something new. And
yeah
then, oh, they're in another one.
or even how to think structures that helps or enhance the collaboration, no? Because one issue that we find a lot in different communities or even in our own experiences, not trying to jump into collaboration with others, is that at some point, if you don't have the financial support or something like that, you cannot, it's really difficult to sustain in
Yeah.
time these initiatives. And another thing that worries me a lot or makes me think is the experience that here in Spain in the cooperative system or ecosystems that exist, because, well, at least in Spain, I would think, especially in Barcelona or Basque Country or other spots inside the peninsula, is that the cooperativism is really alive. But an issue that they have is that they are thought as closed endogamic ecosystems, for saying in some way. I mean that they are into the idea that if we create an ecosystem and it is sustainable in time, it can grow and expand, and like eating the cake to capitalism. I don't know if the analogy is really good, but that's the idea, no? Like expansion from inside, but that's not how sadly things work sometimes, because capitalism is at the end an abstraction of how not only doctrines, which is the abstract and the thought part, but also the infrastructures of the market and all that works. So they at the same time, these cooperatives, they can't escape from some realities of the same system. So they don't grow as a lot as they thought. Maybe, I don't know, like 15 years ago, they thought that cooperativism was going to it. So maybe it's about thinking how other strategies, complementary ones, I don't think that they are really wrong, at the contrary, but we need more strategies and more structure or ways of thinking how to expand this new ways, not creating a floor.
And more stories and more examples and things to point to and go, oh, maybe if we took a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit from over here, this becomes a thing. Doug's got his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to come in specifically on the co-ops thing because I think that's fascinating. So I'm a member of a worker-owned co-op and part of kind of the cooperative ecosystem. And it's also the UN's second ever year of the co-op in 2025. So happy co-op year, everybody. A member of our co-op who was the reason that we set up a co-op rather than just like a straight up business, talks a lot about the cooperative economy, Mondragon in Spain, various other places, etc. And I remember him years ago. We're 9 years into the co-op now. I remember in the early days him talking about this particular type of wasp, which pretends to be a bee and then eats other wasps. Sorry, eats the bees, but it's actually a wasp. And using that as a metaphor for kind of growing the cooperative economy, like destroying capitalism from the inside by setting up, like we're a company limited by guarantee, but in our articles of incorporation, we have the 7 international principles of cooperation, one of which is that you privilege working with other cooperatives because you're trying to build the cooperative economy. And so I think that kind of thing links quite nicely with what I think John was implicitly referencing before with the 2 loops model and kind of hospicing the world that we don't want and composting that, but simultaneously advocating for the kind of world that we do want, which is solidarity, people working together, people owning the means of production, that kind of stuff. And I think that sometimes people say to me, well, just because something's now cooperative or more diverse doesn't mean that it's going to lead to better outcomes. But it's more likely to lead to better outcomes if people own the business they're working for, if it's more diverse, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think if we can be more intentional about what we're aiming for rather than what we're just against, sometimes it can be really useful.
That's brilliant. I love that. There's something that from your wasp example and the way Liz was describing it as well, there's something in the organic versus the mechanic of the sort of like how do you lean on or take inspiration from kind of like ways in which nature has found to do things rather than the sort of like the brute force of mechanisms and financializations perhaps of the capitalism as it is now become. Other thoughts? Told you I'd wait.
While it's quiet, I would like us to just briefly come back to sustainability, because I'm just very conscious that we tend to shit on that term quite a lot these days, because we know that the definition of the word as it is doesn't sound very good, like sustaining the system. But if you go back to the original intention behind sustainability, it was, and this is the Brundtland Report, 1987. I just dragged it up just to make sure I get it right. Sustainability is about development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So as a concept originally, and I don't dispute that it wasn't co-opted, and by the way, my background is not in sustainability, so I'm not here just to defend it for the sake of it, but it's interesting that we should just recognize that sometimes we can shortcut what things feel wrong today, even though at the time was, I think we'd still agree that actually like making life on Earth sustainable in the long term is definitely valuable, but it just doesn't feel like the right kind of framing, like the language, and now how easy it is to sort of like trip up on it and say, well, it's just about sustaining the current system. It's like, well, it wasn't really the intention of what it was trying to do. But for me, I think there's an interesting distinction between sustainability and regeneration in the fact that, and I don't think they're as closely related as we sort of tend to bucket them up, because obviously it's just people putting them into an umbrella of like, well, it's something to do with the environment and about nature. So like sustainable and regenerative must be the same thing. But sustainability is clearly like a steady state, and regeneration has got nothing to do with trying to achieve a steady state. It is about acknowledging things like 2 loops and systemic change and this constant need for evolution and renewal and that sort of stuff. So I do think we get caught up quite a lot in trying to find models and quantifiable frameworks that we can use that actually are inadvertently retaining this mindset of trying to achieve a steady state, no matter even if that steady state is more nature. And that's not quite right, I don't think. I think we're still kind of missing that essence of like what it is to try to get to something that is genuinely more around living in uncertainty and a constant state of change, and how do you do that as a civilization, sort of thing, which I know is still quite abstract, but that was just my thoughts on some of that stuff.
Doug, you wanted to come into this.
Yeah, if that's okay, just really quickly, because I'll feel bad if I don't say this, even though this. One of the side projects that came up my doctoral thesis was getting absolutely fascinated by the concept of ambiguity and how it applies to almost everything we do in life, and how it's often seen as something to avoid. But there was this guy called William Empson, and he ended up doing most of his career in China, and he was an English professor. Really interesting guy, massive neck beard. And he came up with these different types of ambiguity. And really, he was talking about literary criticism. But I got absolutely fascinated by this concept. I wrote a paper with my supervisor. I've used it in consultancy work, etc. And so let's just see if this is a useful kind of way of thinking about it. So this is a continuum of ambiguity. So reducing it down to kind of 3 different areas of ambiguity. And then what Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher, would call dead metaphors, kind of outside of this. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, you'd have things which are just vague, like poorly defined, right? On the right-hand side, you have all of those business bullshit kind of words that don't mean anything anymore. The words are coming out of people's mouths, but it doesn't mean anything. And in between, you've got this really interesting generative space. And that generative space is created because words have both a denotative aspect and a connotative aspect. So when I say the word dove, it means a bird, but also is used as a sign of peace. If I use the word mother, I can't really control how you think about your mother. It might be a very warm relationship, it might be a cold one. Your mother might be alive or dead or whatever. Like, there's a connotative aspect to all of this. And this is where this stuff in the middle sits. So really briefly, and I can bore you to death for hours about this afterwards if you want, generative ambiguity would be the kind of term or something that you come up with which makes sense to you because of your personal context. You have noticed a similarity or some kind of connection between 2 or more things, and it makes sense to you. You try and explain it to someone else, they're like, yeah, okay, I don't really get that. Creative ambiguity would be more maybe this space sometimes where you're talking to people kind of in the same field who have similar kind of backgrounds to you, and you use some kind of terms, some reference points, and people kind of get what you're talking about. And so we're kind of talking about the same thing. But the space which I think is really useful is productive ambiguity. And the way that I often describe this is if you're going to nail something to the wall and you put 2 nails in it, it will be fixed to the wall and it couldn't move. That would be a dead metaphor. But if you nailed it with just 1 nail and it had 360 degrees of movement around that, that would be a metaphor for it being productively ambiguous, because you've got a fixed point, which is a point of reference, but also you can do it in lots of different spaces. So I found this useful in my life around things to do with like digital literacies, having a point as a framework which you can move around, but also things like digital credentials where you've got a technical specification, but you can use it in lots of different situations. So what I'm trying to say, and I'll shut up now, is that there's different types of ambiguity, and you can harness that for your own good. And what you don't want is to over-specify a term so it becomes a dead metaphor. And maybe, just putting it out there, sustainability might be a dead metaphor.
That's super interesting. I want to come back to that at the end for reasons we will see. Fiona.
Well, I come from the land of dead metaphors. Yeah, so to answer the questions posed at the beginning, like what has regenerative practice meant to you? I think probably not that much until relatively recently, and it was because I was working on one of those amazing dead metaphors, ESG, which not only is it a conflation of several metaphors, but it's also been turned into an acronym, which makes it even less meaningful to people in practice. And I think that was kind of what I came to the realization of as working in a consulting situation as a sort of designer of solutions to human problems, let's put it that way, because I was working mostly with HR departments at the time, is this idea of sort of understanding these concepts in the scope of a working business. And you have often experts who are working on sustainability. And I remember having a situation, I can't go into too much detail, but basically the question came up, well, why would anyone who's not an expert in sustainability need to know about sustainability? And it's like, well, because they need to figure out what it means in their work and how they're going to start supporting the broader strategic goals of sustainability. And then we realized that I realized everything I just said in that sentence is full of dead metaphors and quite hard to understand. So I realized that clearly there was a mismatch. So that kind of set me on this journey of learning more about regenerative practice. And Heidi, my colleague and ladies at UX, introduced me to John, and I've looked at more things since then. So how am I taking it forward is that as a result of the platform that this group is on, Luma, I found another group and I joined a hackathon of theirs, and it was more kind of politically focused. But I was so impressed by like their kind of way of looking at kind of an issue and all of the political angles of how you would understand connections between people and understand how to look at that ecosystem of people. And I just thought it inspired me to think about ways of sort of doing more hackathon stuff with problems with people and places and ecosystems. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's great. Could you drop, in fact, we'll drop links like that on the board, the Miro board after towards the end, but just to that group because they sound fascinating as well.
Yeah.
I am talking of the board, I'm going to go back to the board because I have promised the words. So for those for whom steps is new, come on. So steps as of 2025. One, we have a new logo, which is always important, right? But the sort of but just moving away from the sort of the previous stuff, just to sort of to get that intent in there. It's all this is just about following footsteps that you see in different directions. It needn't necessarily be a massive hero's journey for you. It's just a sort of oh, I might go and put my feet where someone else has before. Every Steps Collective, we read the words. Andy talked about them already, but I'm going to read a version now. So these are not meant to be canonical from this point onwards, but today's version is this. Show the easy place to start. As we navigate these transitional times and traverse the emerging regenerative territory, we commonly find that there is not always an obvious path to follow. With many questions to navigate, yet no single answer to guide us, we look for footprints of others to consider where we might take our next steps. However, even the most experienced travellers in these spaces would admit they are continually finding their way, unsure of what is around the next bend or over the next peak. This is an ongoing dance with uncertainty, switching between action and inspiration, acting before we think too much, and thinking before we go too far. So although taking the first or next step can often feel like the hardest, know that you are not walking alone. Whether or not your own trail will become a valuable path for others doesn't matter. We help each other towards a regenerative tomorrow, not as experts, but as parents, neighbours, colleagues and citizens. All our stories are unique and all voices are welcome. There are many paths up the same mountain. So this, from this point on, is essentially, you can grow your own version of the words. Words are seeds. This is just the way that we're describing steps today. The next session that Lizzie runs in February will be different. But also, these are not the only steps sessions that will follow. What we want to do, so this is today's one, and we can sort of we'll, put all the links on here that we've mentioned so far. But in between all of these sessions, this is an invitation. This is to say, like, if you want to run a Steps Collective session, and that could mean going and speaking to someone else you know in a coffee shop with one other person, just sitting down there and sort of like discussing these things, that becomes a Steps Collective session. If we want to run a thing with Doug's productive ambiguity and go, let's just run a separate little online session talking about productive ambiguity around the regenerative word. What does it mean? How do we find that fixed point around which we can orientate? That just becomes a separate session. If we go back to NEP in the spring, which we're planning on doing, that becomes another session and so on. But it doesn't necessarily have to have any of the stewards there. It can be whatever you want it to be. It can facilitate whatever conversation you want it to facilitate. But we're really interested in just like giving people three things, which are kind of like the words from each session and putting on these 12 sessions. The grow your own is sort of like take these as principles and tear around it and decide what to do with it. And then we've also got, if you want to invite other people to speak at things, we had put together a speaker briefing thing, which is just another useful thing that you can send to other people and go, could you come and talk to this little group about this? So then, so the next thing that I'm actually going to do, so I'm just going to spin out a separate one because I found a post from Irit, who I think some of you know, and she was just reflecting on her year of acting locally, and I was like, that would be a really super interesting conversation. So we're getting Irit and Laurie, who I was talking to on the NEP trip, just together online on the 31st of January to talk about acting locally, going to allotments, growing things with schools, and so on. Just a little precise conversation. It's another Steps Collective thing, but it's not one of the kind of like the 12 sessions like these, but that's okay. Because we feel that there's an opportunity to say sort of there is enough here so that other people can take their first steps in this space, but not just as together. We don't all have to be together. These the seeds are good because you can plant them in different places and they grow differently according to the context. We will happily offer you support, thoughts, ideas, voices to come in, whatever you want, etc. But this is yours. If you want to run Steps Collective things, then you can run Steps Collective things. Thoughts, questions, worries, complaints.
Maybe something practical, John, which I can't remember if it's in the loom around WhatsApp, as people kind of percolate on this and perhaps someone decides to have another conversation but wants to share it with others. Are we sharing the WhatsApp group with others, and how can people
Yes,
join?
good point. Good point. Two pieces of infrastructure. There is a WhatsApp group that is open and anyone can join. And then maybe the most important thing as well is, so Luma, which Fiona was talking about, the platform, is really interesting because you can subscribe to the calendar. And so any event that comes up under the kind of like the Steps Collective thing just drops into that calendar. If you want to run a Steps Collective thing, just ask us and we will add it to that calendar. So even if it's just an in-person coffee in Barcelona, Liz, that you say, okay, so let's just do this thing. It's part of Steps Collective. All it is just like we've given you enough words and ideas to start with. And then if you capture some stuff you want to share back, super. So I'll put the WhatsApp and the Luma calendar on the Miro board as well. Any other thoughts? Ideas for sessions you'd like to run? Doug, do you want to do a productive ambiguity one?
I think it's less, do I want to run one? Because I will always talk about this. It's more, does anyone else want to hear me talking about it?
I definitely want to sort of to bury into the kind of like the.
Yeah, I think conversationally, Doug, it sounds really interesting. And like say the dialogue of in practice, what does it mean? Because I think the theory makes a lot of sense to me.
Well,
and then
maybe
where have we
one way
seen it?
into
Where
it,
have we seen it?
but
Valuable kind of. Where have you experimented with it and found like productive value, and like maybe that could spark some inspiration for others as well.
yeah, I think just really quickly, when we're using a term like regenerative, and we've come into this like, well, what are we meaning by it? Because it's used in lots of different situations. The way that I've used it, say, with clients is kind of problematizing stuff that people don't think is a problem, by saying, like, I think you've all got different definitions of this thing, and you don't talk about it. And so you've just got your own mental model in your head, and therefore you're facing in different directions, and we need to face in the same direction. And therefore, how could we come together with a productively ambiguous definition of this thing, which is going to work for all of us? And I could try and facilitate that.
Yeah. Well, there's another one. That's two at least. With 4 minutes to go, I do like trying to hit the, it never usually works, but we'll try and hit the kind of like the hour that we said it was going to be. Has anybody got any further or final comments, things they want to share? Yeah. How does 2025 sound Steps Collective wise so far? Yes, meandering in the right way, Esther. Excellent. Then I'm going to say let's draw this to a close. I will share the WhatsApp and the Luma on the Miro board, which you all have already. I'll send that all out. I'll put this recording up. If there was various things that I was going to put on that board. So if you're on the Miro board and you see January the 10th renewal up here, I'm going to put the Teresa Chahane and Vincent Stanley podcast conversation link up there. So that's where it'll be. If anybody else wants to share any of the other things that like Doug's post or anything else, put it all in that page, and any notes you want to make around it too, please do. With that, thank you very much, everybody. That was a lovely hour. I'm very excited for the year. Have a lovely rest of Friday.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day and weekends.